till I'm paid again. Well, the weekend comes, but I'm dreading Sunday. I grab a cooler of beer and a couple of my friends, and this red dirt road, it goes on forever. Some would say the party never ends, but I feel my time is growing closer. And that might be where it all begins. Yeah, I'm gonna live each day like it's a Saturday. Ooh, I wanna move along right down the line. If you ain't got friends, you ain't got nothing. Ooh, you better pick a side before you're out of time. Ooh, let me tell you son, you're running out of time. Hey, like it's a Saturday. Ooh, I wanna move along right down the line. If you ain't got friends, you ain't got nothing. You better pick a side before you're out of time. Oh, let me tell you son, you're running out of time. Before you're out of time. Yeah, I'm gonna live each day like it's a Saturday. Ooh, I wanna move along right down the line. If you ain't got friends, you ain't got nothing. Ooh, you better pick a side before you're out of time. You're running out of yours and now
You're listening to Rippin' Common Sense Radio.
That's right, where we take you well into the midnight hour with our special Art Bell Archives show happening tonight and every night this weekend, starting at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10/9 Central. Tune in as we open up the Art Bell Archives and dive into the lost classics of a vocal treasure. We take a look at those stories and we bring them up to date and we share them with you. We ask for your input and your shout-outs, your call-ins as we go through the most amazing stories ever told. Tune in tonight and every night as we reinvestigate the Art Bell Archives live.
The Art Bell Archive Show, 7 p.m. Pacific, 10/9 Central, rippincommonsense.com.
Countdown for blast off. X -5, -4, -3, -2, X -1. Fire.
Good evening and welcome to another episode of the Art Bell Archive live show. I'm your host, AJ, the Rippin' Rabbit. Give yourselves a round of applause for being smart enough to be here. Tonight's Thanksgiving Day special. Now, I mentioned on the air last week that I would be off tonight. However, I just can't stay away from you. So let that tryptophan work its way through your bloodstream tonight as we go on a journey, a mystery of vanished towns. Buckle up your seatbelts as we dive down the mysterious rabbit hole of towns that evaporated, vanished into thin air, once there and then no more. It's a wild journey on this holiday special tonight, Thursday, November 28th, 2019. Now, the subject we're going to look at was a topic a few times on the AM Coast to Coast radio show with Art Bell. A few various guests that would join him from time to time to speak about the wild phenomenon and weird cases of entire towns that vanished without a trace. One such guest to speak about this type of activity was a man by the name of Brent Swancer. And he's an author who's living in Japan. He's written articles for MU and Daily Grail and has been a guest on the Coast to Coast AM show. And tonight, as we reach down into the Art Bell archives and dust off this subject, we'll bring it up to date. But first, tonight our tale begins in the tiny little town, Boscobel, Wisconsin. Its claim to fame is the wild turkey capital of America. Fitting that we chose to highlight this as our starting point this evening. Now, in this area, there are reports of several paranormal activities, including the disappearance of an entire town. Now, just south of Boscobel, there's an unusual story of a little village that was detailed in the book The Driftless Spirits, Ghosts of Southwest Wisconsin by author Dennis Boyer, where he includes a story about Anatone, Wisconsin, which is on Grant County E, west of Livingston. Now, this story explains how even a century ago, Anatone would temporarily disappear. It goes on to say that in early days, such experiences were viewed as insanity. Those fortunate to survive the change usually ended up in their own little room on a country farm. And for those that didn't make it through the shift, were stuck on the other side. Now, to put this story in perspective, Anatone is among those disappeared and dismantled towns. As with so many others, there is barely a trace left of human activity or even any kind of habitation. But Anatone belongs in a different category. It was a town, an entire town of platted streets. It had substantial housing and businesses. It wasn't just a, pioneer stopping grounds or a temporary dugout. Now, Anatone was also different in the type of story that it left behind. These other abandoned towns have their stable ghosts and blacksmith shop ghosts, but with Anatone, it appears that the town itself is the ghost. Now, my guest tonight, Craig K., is an expert on vanishes. Craig, good evening and welcome to the show.
Hello, nice to be here.
Now, describe for me what an expert of vanishes is.
An expert on vanishes. Someone who knows different subtle ways of making things disappear, sometimes in a puff of smoke.
Kind of like the town of Anatone that just vanished off the face of the map. Now, these types of occurrences, be that as it may, they're paranormal, perhaps an illusion. How does one go about explaining the disappearance or the vanishing of an entire town?
Well, I'm not sure exactly how to make an entire town disappear, but there have been instances where magicians in history have made entire areas disappear. I believe it was the Suez Canal. The grandson or grandnephew of one of the originators of the Magic Circle actually was hired by the British Army and became an officer. And he made all of the encampments there disappear to the Luftwaffe, so they couldn't actually bomb them. Also managed to make tanks look like trucks and trucks look like tanks. So people have been making large things disappear for quite a while. How to make an entire town disappear, though, sounds kind of interesting.
Very. And to go back to what you're saying, in the form of defense, illusion has been used to camouflage entire towns and military.
Oh, yeah. I mean, people have been using illusions to mask small towns, to mask vehicles, to mask encampments. They've been using magic for military devices for centuries. I mean, Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin back in Belgium, he was asked by the Belgian government to go to the Congo because it was run by Belgium at the time. And he did a handful of illusions to make the fakirs there worried because there was a magic man that was stronger than them and freaked out the entire country. And they then rescinded control back to the Belgians without firing one shot. Magicians have been doing stuff like this for a long time.
This is fascinating stuff. Now, in terms of this Wisconsin legend, in the town of Anatone, who recordedly was there one moment and then just seemed to vanish the next, some indication has occurred that this could be a bout of large schizophrenia, perhaps. And we're told about the recollections of how sometimes the entire town was there and sometimes it wasn't. And this could be a psychological trick, perhaps, in the townspeople.
Could be a psychological trick if it seemed to appear to be there and then sometimes not and then back again. Possibly there was some sort of, I mean, you get mirages in the desert that make things appear hundreds of miles closer than they are. It's distinctly possible that it just appeared through some sort of electromagnetic or refracting of light to disappear or reappear. In the case of, here's a whole continent, Atlantis, it disappeared. They've discovered it, that it actually existed, and kind of got buried underneath the earth. It was a big seismic activity, buried the entire continent, and they found that parts of what they reckon to be Atlantis is what is responsible for the marble that's been dug up in Italy in the past couple of centuries. It's actually the continent of Atlantis being dug up because it got turned to marble. Crazy.
Now, where did you hear this?
I read an article in the last couple of weeks. Geologists were doing digs and they realized, wait, this is an entire continental plate that they've discovered underneath different strata of Earth. And the only thing they can think of is that it is, in fact, actually Atlantis. And if not Atlantis, then some other continental disappeared part of the world that somehow has disappeared. They didn't know where, didn't know how, but they've realized that all this marble has been dug up and used to decorate Italy centuries ago was actually from probably the lost city of Atlantis.
That's phenomenal. Now, in a way, you're sounding a bit Mandela effect-ish, because we know that continents have shifted. We know through the Mandela effect that different continents are now in different areas. But what you're saying is that through this type of a shift, Atlantis completely vanished off the face of the earth.
Got completely buried. The earth essentially swallowed it up. It probably took a few centuries, I would imagine, but different tectonic plates kind of shifted over each other, which is how, mountain ranges get formed sometimes. Sometimes volcanoes erupting, but sometimes a tectonic plate moves, one shifts under the other, and you've got a mountain range. Well, if your city happens to be on the lower plate, you're gone.
Fascinating. Now, that's not the case in southwestern Wisconsin, where there isn't this kind of land shifting that would cause the vanishing of the little town of Anatone. And we've heard personal accounts from the area that draw further into the mystery. Of course, one gentleman states sometimes Anatone's there, sometimes it's not. And we had a woman that we came across in some of her journaling and writing where she outlaid just an enormous wealth of information about this phenomenon. She said, there's always something odd about Anatone. There were always the rumors about runaways and runaway kids and runaway husbands and runaway wives. But this, in this particular instance, is a runaway town. And in her elder years, she went on to say that we came back the next day and the darn thing was gone again. Okay, now what she's speaking about is a book, because they wanted to find record of this town, Anatone. So they went to the county centennial volumes where a known book was there to exist and hopefully would shed some light on this situation. But they had just the darndest time finding a copy of this book. So she went to the library. First, it was off the shelf. Then they searched the tables and the carts, and then it was back on the shelf. And just before the library was to close, it would appear and disappear. And again, they came back the next day. The darn thing was gone again, so on and so forth, almost to the point where it wasn't even in the card catalog. There wasn't even a card for this county record of this town. So there was bizarre activity reported within just the records of this town. Would there be anything supernatural or paranormal that could create the vanishing of information?
That's distinctly possible. I'm not an expert on paranormal things. I could imagine if someone was trying to hide it, doing stuff like that to mess people about in the library is a very good way of doing it, especially if it's the only record. If you can make the only record disappear off the face of the earth, no one can prove stuff either way, which means you're left up that creek without that paddle when it comes to knowledge. So, and he who controls the knowledge controls everything. So if you can't control a specific knowledge of something interesting and weird, then you control that thing that is interesting or weird.
Excellent point. When it comes to the book, I get it. It could be just a misplacement of the county record. But today, in 2019, it is next to impossible to find anything other than the Anatone listing on the actual Google map. Now, I did some research earlier this week. I did find a documented Albeter family record of this particular county in Wisconsin, where he does refer to a small town of Anatone in southwestern Wisconsin. He goes on to say that this was even a place for a buggy factory and a wagon shop, and there was a blacksmith, and we know that there was also a flour mill in Anatone. Yet the state of Wisconsin has zero record of this existing, and that's when the story starts to get bizarre or paranormal, as you say. The people that we were able to discuss this with that had the memories were in their 90s, very old. And we found a lady in a nursing home who was nearly 100 years old. And she went on to speak just absolute phenomenal stories. Now, she was born in Anatone. She was quite feeble and, like I said, wheelchair bound, yet she still seemed very alert. Okay, she seemed to have good recollection. She told the most outlandish story about how Anatone disappears and reappears, and she was afraid she would disappear too. So clearly, psychologically, she was attached to this legend of this town vanishing and reappearing. And apparently, the loved ones that had passed over, Anatone became a gateway of sorts for them to reconnect. So when Anatone was there, you could step in and share time with loved ones that had passed. And if you chose to stay, when Anatone would vanish, you would vanish with the community. Now, that seems a little far-fetched, huh?
Does seem a little bit far-fetched. It sounds like old Irish fables, or Scottish Lorna Doone, the town that would only appear on certain nights of the year. And to be honest, there's myths about stuff like that. Most countries have a myth similar to that of places that would appear and disappear. Lorna Doone's probably one of the most famous ones. I think it was, I'm almost certain it's Lorna Doone in Scotland. It would come out of the mists in the morning and people go, where'd this town come from? Oh, that's Lorna Doone. You don't want to go there. Oh, yes. There's lots of fables in Ireland and Scotland. There's lots of them. But it does sound very interesting, especially when you had someone who managed to get down on paper in black and white their recollections of it happening while they were still here. It's just a shame they're not sitting in this room to talk to us right now. That'd be cool.
You're absolutely right. And, again, with the outlandish stories, even urban folklore and legends are in some way based in truth, like this show, The Outlander, for instance.
Right. And the Outlander does have a lot of, I think the word they used to describe it, it's an historical fiction. So it's a work of fiction based on real life happenings. The Battle of Culloden, that definitely happened. And there was a point in the show where all of these prisoners get killed, but Jamie Fraser lives. Well, that was put in the book because there was a historical reference to these Jacobites getting, killed off, executed, but one member of the Fraser clan was left alive. So in Outlander, it was Jamie Fraser. He was the one that was spared.
Truly fascinating stuff. Please hold on, Craig. We'll be back with you in just a moment. My guest this evening, Mr. Craig KIETH, expert on vanishes. All sorts of vanishes, not just towns. As you're going to hear in the upcoming segments, Anatone is not the only town to have experienced this particular phenomenon. And when I first heard of this story, I sought out any individual with any bit of knowledge. We're very fortunate to have somebody that has a personal connection to the area with detailed recollections of the town, its existence, its people, and most importantly, its disappearance. Now, I am joined by a guest listener from Stitzer, Wisconsin, which is just outside where Anatone once existed. An eyewitness report from the ground. Caller, are you there?
Hello.
Hello. Happy Thanksgiving, and thanks so much for being here. Now, you are just outside of Anatone?
Anatone. Mm-hmm.
Or should I say where Anatone was?
Yeah.
Are there any buildings left?
No, there are not.
But you say at one point there was quite a lot of stuff. What kind of things do you remember or recall that were there?
I know there used to be several things there. I mean, a flour mill. There used to be I think they had a school there.
Rock School?
Rock School would have been one of the old buildings that was there. I know.
And according to the legend, everything, all of it, the entire town and all of its people are gone, and there's not anything left.
Nope, just farms.
Yet you remember that it was there.
It used to be.
Unbelievable. A truly remarkable story. A town completely vanished off the map. And caller, do you have any clue as to what happened to Anatone?
I have not.
But you would say firsthand from your own experience, it's very strange.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, we thank you so much for sharing your personal story tonight. You have a wonderful evening.
Yep. Bye.
There you have it. A firsthand account, a local resident's recollection of Anatone, without explanation, vanishing. We'll be back with my guest, Craig KIETH, in just a few moments. But first, let's take a quick look at the schedule coming up for the rest of the weekend. We're here tomorrow night, Friday night, with our Dark Secrets show. Join us as we dust off an Art Bell subject on the Archive Live show dealing with dark secrets. It'll be a very interesting evening, so that will be tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10/9 Central. Then on Saturday night, we take a fascinating look at modern time machines. That's Saturday, November 30th, 2019, starting at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10/9 Central, and we'll wrap up Sunday night with Free Energy. Sunday, December 1st, folks. Can you believe it? In just a few days, it will be Christmas. Anyways, we'll deal with Cold Fusion, Tesla, and a great evening on Sunday night and every night this weekend. And tonight, Thanksgiving, our topic, Vanished Towns, is an intriguing one. If you've been listening, you understand exactly what I'm saying. And if you're just joining us, we're going to go back to my studio guest backstage, Mr. Craig KIETH, as we continue the discussion of vanished towns.
Now, Craig, you were saying you had some changes to what you were saying earlier.
True. So I do have to apologize because it is Thanksgiving. I'm full of tryptophan, possibly 1 or 2 Miller Lights, and lots of other really good food. Thanks for having us at your house. So I was randomly trying to remember the Celtic place that disappeared, and my brain latched on Lorna Doone. And I then remembered, wait, that's a romantic novel and movie. But there are lots of other places. So you take the mythology that is based on some historical fact, but some people debate it, of King Arthur. Well, apparently where he was buried, it was called Avalon in all the stories. And his arch nemesis, she said she was going to, was it Morgan Le Fay? I'm trying to remember, but said she was going to make it disappear and reappear in another place. Now, some modern scientists believe that Avalon is now at the site of where Glastonbury Tour is. And for people that have heard about the UK and some of the music festivals, there's a big music festival in Glastonbury every single year. It's just south, I believe it's the Severn Estuary, which is the southernmost point of Wales going over into England. So there's a lot of Celtic mythology coming from Wales. So that is one place in the UK that apparently disappeared. That there's in, I think, Brittany in France, there's a place called, is it Ys? It was spelled Y-S. There's some Scandinavian places apparently have been known to appear and disappear in their folklore and mythology. So a lot of places all around the world actually have mythological towns that have appeared and disappeared almost at will. or when specific events happen. So it's not something that different countries haven't experienced or is in the popular cultural mindset.
No, especially in popular cultural mindset. We think about urban legends, we think about tall tales, and our country here in the United States, of course, as opposed to those stories, our stories don't reach as far deep as some of.
It's a new country. So compared to, well, Wales, for example, the United States is only a few hundred years old, whereas some bars in Wales are a few hundred years old. Some churches are over 1,000 years old. And that's just Wales. There are other countries as well. And then if you get into not even churches, but some of the monuments that they built in Wales, in Ireland, in Scotland, some of these are a few thousand years old. Some of the cairns and what have you. And there's mythologies built on those too, that different, spectral beings might emanate from them and what have you. So,
well, let's hold the spectral beings for a moment. Earth Daughter wants to point out that and we talked about this before, our guest caller who called from Stittsville, just outside of Boscobel, which is the wild turkey capital of the world. Okay. Fitting for Thanksgiving this evening. But Earth Daughter says sort of sounds like Anatone, spelling, ? Is a Mandela effect. And we talked just before that call that perhaps there's a little bit of Mandela taking place here.
It's distinctly possible for people that ascribe Mandela effect to certain things, like Luke, I am your father. Well, he never said that in any of the Star Wars movies. That there's so many instances of it happening in popular culture that possibly there is a certain amount of credence that you could lend to it. Whether that's what happened with Anatone remains to be seen. And the problem with Mandela effects is they're kind of hard to prove.
That's true. And again, before we took the call from somebody close on the ground there that remembers that there was a full-on town, streets, buildings, even a school that completely vanished without a trace. And we talked about the county record disappearing from the library and the woman who recollected her aspect of Anatone. And she suggested that even though it would temporarily disappear, she said that in the early days, these experiences would be viewed as insanity. And we researched the area, and just outside of Anatone, in the early days, which is now a nursing assisted living area, they had a mental asylum there.
Okay.
And the fourth floor was reserved for the absolutely insane by submission of family.
Right.
And it's remarkable that over 75% of the fourth floor were listed as residents of Anatone. So when we think about by design, when we think about urban legends that perhaps could be utilized by design, this is where this story in this small little town in southwestern Wisconsin becomes important to the modern Mandela effects. Wouldn't you agree?
It certainly does sound interesting. If you've got, 75% of people you said on one ward being ascribed to have come from a certain town that may or may not exist, and even if it does, may or may not be there all the time, you have to wonder, there's two sides of this. A, is the disappearance of Anatone a factual thing? Is it not? And B, if it isn't, is it some sort of multiple psychosis that a vast majority of people are undergoing at the same time? And if so, is that the reason why they've been put in that ward? And even if you ascribe to the second viewpoint, where did they get the idea of this town, and why are they all thinking the same thing? So there's more questions than there are answers. I'll say that.
Well, this woman who relayed the story of Anatone and documented this seemed ready to die. She seemed ready to face her maker. She was well into the prime and past the prime of her life. But, she was uncertain about being pulled into a place where time, the past, the present, and the future were melded together. And we can theorize that if over 75% of a mentally insane asylum within the area, miles away, still there today, contained that many residents of Anatone, and if this were a reality, that the city would be there sometimes and then not, and we listen to these words of being able to connect with loved ones on the other side, we could see how during the times when Anatone wasn't there, this could drive you insane.
True story. Yeah, that would definitely unhinge you a little bit. If this is the case, if Anatone exists and doesn't exist depending on the day of the year, and if you got to be there, especially if it was with a loved one that had passed, if it wasn't there, I'm sure it would unhinge you somewhat.
Well, she goes on to explain how these incidents gradually increased in frequency until Anatone could not be found except on rare occasions. Okay, so this would be a loved one's birthday, perhaps, or a holiday or whatnot. Anatone's visible time gradually decreased until it could only be seen a few days a year, and then only for a few moments.
Just a fleeting glimpse. That's gotta suck.
If you're the one that's left behind.
Right.
And of course, these are two widows and two widowers that were born in Anatone, that went to the rock school that the on-location guest caller spoke about, rock school, that no longer is there. Okay, just overnight, not there. And she suggested that the openings will become fewer and fewer until the link with Anatone closes forever. And before we went to that call, we spoke about Outlander.
Right.
And there's a running theme in that storyline.
Right.
That the time frame of returning back to where you left.
Right. So the time frames in Outlander, so in the future, she's moving at a constant speed. Well, the history where she ended up at also was moving at a constant speed, at the same speed. So when she went back to her future time, she goes forward 15, 20 years. Well, when she gets back into ancient Scotland, it's also moved forward 10 or 20 years, 15, 20 years, which meant everyone had moved forward. A lot of people thought she'd died. So maybe there's a corollary there. Maybe something's happening with this town where, maybe people are moving on, but I don't know. It's very, very, very strange. Disappearing and appearing.
Well, and again, the fact that this is linked through other time frames, through other cultures, is beyond belief to me. Now, this woman from Anatone, who was born there, as she's, ending her life, she then suggests something absolutely astounding. She said, you could use the opening to go back there, and she claimed that she knew people who had crossed over. And she said She had thought about it herself, but was worried about her need for her wheelchair and medication. So if you are in 2019, in this particular woman's case, would have been, mid-70s,
Right.
that she's recollecting, you would be fearful of perhaps moving to a place where you don't have access to your meds or these types of, daily functions.
Right.
But if this is actual crossover place, you wouldn't really need those things, would you?
I suppose that's true. So, I mean, if we're going to buy into the fact that this is a real place, so there's two options. One is there's a concurrent time frame that's moving at the same speed as ours, possibly, but maybe it's 100 years back or further. And if, say, you've got a heart condition, you're on metoprolol or some other heart med, well, they don't have that back then. So that would be a worry. Now, on the flip side, if you're buying into this place as a real place, and if it's not something that's moving at a different time, but at the same rate as we are, and it is somewhere that possibly, your antecedents are living, and you can go and meet with them, then I would have to imagine that you wouldn't need your medicine, that you would be fine and dandy, and you might even be hale and hearty and be able to get up out of your wheelchair. Who knows?
Well, and that's the thought, is that if Anatone is actually in some way connected to the recent experiments of CERN or time travel, or as our Earth daughter has pointed out, shifting through parallel realities via the Mandela effect, then we have to start to look at the mathematical applications of this type of theory. And I did receive a very interesting email earlier this week from one listener who pointed out some imperfections in pi. Now, you seem to know quite a bit about pi, correct?
I know a decent amount about pi. It's an interesting... It's what's the phrase? It's an abstract number that doesn't repeat. It's infinite. Most people use it to measure a circle, but it actually does a lot more than that. You can use it in cryptography because it's infinite. You can pick a point and choose a certain amount of digits and use that as your code. If you changed it using base 27 into alpha instead of numeric, I believe the first word that pops up is actually the word pi, which is kind of weird. And if you randomly had the book on pi and got to the position 9,202,591, you would actually eventually find Jenny's phone number, 8675309. Remember I Googled that about 3 years ago? It's still in my head.
Unbelievable. And we're going to talk more about that coming up on Saturday night. We're going to have a special guest here who's going to deal with time machines. But as this woman suggested these astounding natures of Anatone, she claimed that Anatone was heavily populated by real people and by ghosts, which makes sense to her explanation. She believed it was a place where the living could exist physically and their departed loved ones would be there with them by their side. So in this theory of, relativity with pi, there is a point where this becomes somewhat logical.
I suppose if there is an explanation for this, it would be in pi, believe it or not. Because it's an infinite number that doesn't repeat, if you went alpha instead of numeric, at some point this conversation will pop up. And if there is an explanation for it, it might take you 1 billion years and all the crazy supercomputers. It'll be in there too.
And when it is, we're going to keep you up to date with it, that's for sure. Now, it's easy to see that the information about the other world made a profound impression on these local people from Anatone. And it, by and large, their good, close friends, loved ones departed this world. And Anatone became something they could hold on to, perhaps, but nevertheless, Google Maps still shows this area to be Anatone. As the guest listener this evening told us, there are still vivid memories today in 2019 of a town that doesn't exist. And Anatone isn't the only place in the world. We know, as our guest Craig has explained, this has taken place in mythology and through lore in other lands far behind or far beyond this one. And these myths have percolated amongst locals that perhaps were immigrants to the area. We know a lot of Germans. We know a lot of Norwegians came to the area.
Oh, yeah. All over Wisconsin, especially Scandinavian and German countries. Some of the Dutch were in the area as well. I mean, most of them ended up in Pennsylvania, but some of them ended up in Wisconsin too. But definitely Germanic and Scandinavian all over Wisconsin. Excuse me. Different parts of America, different cultures. You go to, the Bayou in Louisiana, there's a lot of French-speaking people because it used to be owned by France. Obviously, in some of the southern states, you had the Spanish. But, different people from all over the world ended up in different parts of America. And not even just in the last couple of 100 years, go back a few hundred years before that, the first Western settlers that ever landed on this continent were Norsemen. They were Vikings. And they've got recordings of their settlements. They found them. And they also found out that they went, yeah, we don't like it. And they left. But leaving behind the settlements so people could find it hundreds of years later. But so, there are different people from all over the world that have ended up here before modern history has been written down. So who knows what mythologies they brought with them.
If you're just joining us, my guest tonight is Craig KIETH. He is an expert on vanishes. A big shout out to all of you for joining us on this Thanksgiving night special for Vanish Towns. Hello, Royal Blunts. I'm sorry you didn't get the notification. There was something weird with our YouTube this evening. Anyways, the discovery of this story is something remarkable. And as we look at Google Maps and we see that Anatone is actually listed, it has a GPS coordinates. We've been on the phone this evening with eyewitnesses that claim this was a bustling town, no longer on the face of the Wisconsin maps or landscape. Truly remarkable stories, no matter how you look at it, from what direction. It is phenomenal, in a way, to think that these are the stories that are passed down from generation to generation on nights like this, Thanksgiving.
Yep. It is a night for stories. It's a night for people getting together and sharing stories. And maybe some of those stories in a couple of 100 years' time are going to end up being talked about on some radio type show like this one. Who knows?
You never know. And you're not going to get the information out of a woman like this in the dying days of her last moments to describe this kind of a love story.
Right.
If it weren't some sort of a heartfelt impact on her life.
Right. Obviously, it just by reading the words that she said, it obviously meant a lot to her. Obviously, she was born there, but the words are heartfelt. She's saying stuff that happened. She's like, I don't know why it disappeared. I know that it did. It kept coming back, and we started figuring out possibly why and how, but I'm not sure if I want to go there. And that's gotta hurt. Like, if she in her heart of hearts believes that her passed on loved ones are there and she can't go and meet them because she's worried about her meds and taking care of herself, that's got to be heartbreaking for her. So this obviously meant a lot to her.
And you really truly believe a foundation of folklore and myth from other parts of the world, long before United States, Wisconsin, and of course the little town of Anatone ever existed.
There's folklore everywhere, and it's just like cliches. Cliches are generally based on something that's true. How much of it that is true, sometimes we never find out. Irishmen like to get drunk and get into fights. Not strictly speaking accurate. I'm from Ireland. I like to have a drink. I don't like to get drunk, and I don't like to get into a fight. But some did. So how much of this is true, we're probably never going to find out, especially if we try looking in the library, because the book's gone. So there's no annotated evidence that way. There's just a first-hand account that got written down at some point. So that's all the words that we have to go on that, because apart from that, there's no maps with it unless you look at Google Maps. And even then, it just says it's part of an unincorporated township in a certain area of Wisconsin, but that's it.
And that's the story, and that's what legends are made on. That's for sure. Craig Keith, it's a pleasure having you in the studio tonight.
You're very, very welcome. Pleasure to be here.
Interesting. An expert on vanishes. What do you think will be vanishing next?
Dessert. On this Thanksgiving night, I'm almost sure.
Big round of applause to our special guest, expert of Vanisher, Craig Keith, for joining us tonight. That's for sure, folks. And a big shout out to all of you for joining us on a Thanksgiving evening. Maybe you can let that tryptophan kick in.
Wow, what definitely a wild ride on tonight's episode of Vanished Towns. Something to think about, that's for sure. We draw conclusions only based on what we know. I'm here tonight and every night this weekend, starting at 7 p.m. Pacific and 10/9 Central, with the Art Bell Archive live show, where we do exactly what we've just done. Dust off the archive subjects of Art Bell and bring them up to date. Tomorrow night, our show deals with dark secrets. That's tomorrow night, Friday. Saturday, we explore the world of time machines and time travel again. Saturday, with special guest. You're going to want to stay tuned to that for sure. And then we finish off the weekend Sunday night with our episode on free energy and Tesla. So give yourselves a round of applause for being smart enough to be here. I'm AJ, the Rippin' Rabbit, reminding you on this Thanksgiving evening to take care of yourself and each other. Until tomorrow night, good night.
Mr. Rabbit makes his way through the reeds. He tries to hide his very long ears under a big hat, 'cause he wants to be incognito. You try to talk to him, you see him disappear. Such a creature like this, in my body and the rabbit face. Oh, they call it Mr. Rabbit. Oh, Mr. Rabbit.
Once there was an old man living in an old house down by the lake. Rumor says the man was hunting for rabbits just for fun. Since the day the rabbit disappeared for a while, then came back and cast a spell over the old man. So he looks like a rabbit too now.
You're listening to Ripon Common Sense Radio.
That's right, where we take you well into the midnight hour with our special Art Bell Archives show happening tonight and every night this weekend, starting at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10/9 Central. Tune in as we open up the Art Bell Archives and dive into the lost classics of a vocal treasure. We take a look at those stories and we bring them up to date and we share them with you. We ask for your input and your shout outs, your call ins as we go through the most amazing stories ever told. Tune in tonight and every night as we reinvestigate the Art Bell Archives live.
The Art Bell Archive Show. 7 p.m. Pacific, 10/9 Central, RiponCommonSense.com.